Have you ever spent a British pound coin? And if you have you ever taken a good look at one before handing it over to the cashier? Well, if you haven't, and actually perhaps even if you have, you might not have realised that this little coin here contains a fascinating and often misrepresented piece of the royal history of these British Isles. And that, ladies and gentlemen, is today's History Hall. So, what's the historical deal with the pound coins? Well, it's not actually about the currency itself. It's about what's printed on these coins that I want to talk to you today. Now, if you've got one of these coins handy, or you can get your hands on one of them, have a good look at it, and you'll see that around the edge of the perimeter of the coin, it used to be around the actual milled edge, but now it's around about the outer edge of the circle, there are a few words. Elizabeth II, DG, Reg, FD. Now that stands for Elizabeth II, DG, Deo Gratias, which is Latin for thanks be to God, Reg, which is short for the Latin term Regina, which means Queen, and then the two letters that we're particularly interested in today. It says FD. What does that stand for? Well, once again, it's a piece of Latin, and it stands for Fide Defensor, or, in plain English, Defender of the Faith. Now, in the current reign, you would simply change the name in all of that. The only other thing you would change was Regina to Rex, Queen to King, but other than that, you would stick in Charles III, and the title would remain the same, because Fide Defensor, or Defender of the Faith, is one of the official titles of the British monarch. But it's more of a religious title than a temporal title. So why do the British kings and queens have it in their extensive list of official titles? Well, it's a very old story, and it dates back to the 16th century. And if you were to ask the average person about the title Defender of the Faith, they would probably start telling you about Henry VIII. And although that wouldn't be wrong, it's certainly not the whole story. But admittedly, we have come to associate that title almost exclusively with King Henry VIII, and for very, very good reason. He was one of the great royal stars of his age. He was one of the great Renaissance princes of Europe. He was thoroughly famous amongst the other royal courts of the continent, and when he did something, people paid attention. And in the year 1521, Henry certainly did something that was worthy of attention, because you see, he wrote a book and he published it. Now, this piece of light bedtime reading had the snappy and memorable little title of Assertio Septem Sacramentorum, and what it effectively did was gave a counterblast argument to the Protestant reformer Martin Luther. You see, Henry was a very fervent Catholic at this point in his life. In fact, despite what he went on to do later on, Henry would always have claimed throughout his life, up until his deathbed, to have been a fervent Catholic. But I think the Pope of the time might have disagreed with that. But nevertheless, when he published this book in 1521, he certainly considered himself a most Catholic prince, and he was thoroughly offended by some of the accusations against the Catholic Church made by this upstart monk Martin Luther in Germany. Now, his 1517 book, with the equally snappy title of Disputation on the Power and Efficacy of Indulgences, was a book which Henry had read voraciously, and he had thoroughly disagreed with it. To say he was offended would have been an understatement, and almost immediately, it is said, he began to write his own counter-argument in the form of the Assertio. Now, Henry was an incredibly learned monarch. He was a musician. He spoke several and wrote several languages fluently. He was a keen disputer of theological matters. He was a pretty knowledgeable guy. He'd had a great education for a prince of his time. And it's said that he had written this book with the advice and the help of a man he later had brutally executed, Sir Thomas More. And there's a bit of a disagreement to this day as to just how much advice Sir Thomas More put into this book, how much of it was his work and how much of it was actually Henry's. But I digress. Whoever wrote and put together the majority of it between these two men, it was Henry's name that was firmly on the cover. Now, this book was 150,000% on the side of the Catholic Church and of the Pope's authority, and of course, naturally, it was welcomed by all Catholic monarchs across Europe. It was hailed as a great work of the faith, and the Pope of the time was, understandably, absolutely thrilled. Martin Luther was having an unsettlingly successful time of holding the church to account. They didn't seem to be able to get a handle on this fire that he had set across Europe, and by this point the officials in the Vatican were starting to get pretty hot under the collar as this man was carrying his testimony across the continent. But to have a prince of Henry of England's stature write a book so eloquent and so theologically, as far as they were concerned, sound, which backed up basically everything they said was true, must have been, and no pun intended, something of a godsend. In fact, the Vatican was so impressed by this piece of work by Henry, it gave it its own name. It became known as the Henrician Affirmation. And to an ego the size of Henry Tudor's, this sort of thing must have been like manna from heaven. He must have eaten it up with a spoon. But Pope Leo X wasn't finished rewarding his good and faithful servant in England. He had something else up his sleeve to reward Henry with. He had a title for him, and that title was Fide Defensor, Defender of the Faith. Now, this wasn't just a nickname. This was an official title given by the Pope to the king, and importantly, it was hereditary, or at least Henry made it hereditary. Whether Leo X intended it to be in the first place or not was neither here nor there. He wasn't going to be in the picture much longer. But for the time being, everyone was great friends in Catholic Europe, and Henry was their star boy of the week. He had his new title, he had his new book, and quite frankly, he was in clover. But we all know what happened next. Henry fell in love with someone when he was already married, and he tried to get the church to annul his marriage to his first wife so he could marry his second one, and the church said no for various reasons, and so Henry did what an ego that size does. He simply broke away from the church, started up his own church, set himself up as the head of that church, and the rest, as they say, is history. But apart from passing on the new title of Supreme Head of the Church, Henry passed on the title of Defender of the Faith as well. And that has meant that every subsequent English and later British monarch has carried that title, and that is why we still see it written on our currency to this very day. King Charles III, the current King of Great Britain, is also Defender of the Faith. He's talked about wanting to change that in the past to simply Defender of Faith, but it's not just quite that easy. This is a title which has become so ingrained within the British monarchy, it's almost as integral as God Save the King. And that, ladies and gentlemen, is the story of Defender of the Faith and how it came to be so ingrained in our national history. Or is it? Because although we've come to associate that title with Henry VIII and subsequent kings of England and so on and so forth through the union of the crowns, etc., etc., he wasn't the only monarch of the kingdoms on these British Isles to hold that title. He wasn't even the first. That accolade, ladies and gentlemen, goes to this chap here, King James IV of Scotland. Now, although Scotland's King James IV isn't nearly as well known as his brother-in-law, King Henry VIII, in my opinion, he should be. He was one of the great Renaissance princes of Europe of the time. This man was every bit as learned as Henry and then some. He was a scientist. He was a patron of the arts. He was a man of letters. He was a man of languages, and he was a man of diplomacy. This was a king who brought Scotland out of the Middle Ages and into the Renaissance, and he put that small country firmly on the European map. Now, he was also a most Catholic majesty. He too was absolutely intent on doing whatever he needed to do to defend the Catholic faith. But in his case, it wasn't so much an errant monk that he felt he needed to use the powers of his kingship to defend his faith, but rather the power of the Ottoman Empire. Now, James had pretty good relations with the Pope of that time, who was Pope Julius II, and he had suggested to the Pope that another crusade might be necessary. Now, that crusade never actually happened in eventuality, but the very fact that he'd come up with this fantastic idea was enough for Julius II to give him a special award. In 1507, he was given the title Protector and Defender of the Christian Faith by Julius II, a full 14 years before Henry received his title from a later pope. And Henry wasn't the last monarch on these islands to be awarded that title in his own right either. King James IV's son and successor, King James V of Scotland, was also awarded the title by Pope Paul III as a sort of bribe, it seems, to try and prevent him from taking the same course of action that his uncle, Henry VIII, had done by breaking away from the Church of Rome. And there is a suggestion that Henry had been whispering in his nephew's ear, trying to get him, to urge him to do the same thing that he had done. But James was having none of it. He remained true to the Catholic Church. In fact, he was a persecutor of Protestants in Scotland, and therefore a very grateful Pope Paul III threw that very same title in his direction as well. However, unlike the English monarchy and eventually the British monarchy, the Scottish kings did not pass that title down to their successors. Yes, James IV had it. Yes, his son James V had it, but they were both given it in their own right by two separate popes. And I suspect that when Henry was given that title, it wasn't meant to be hereditary either. It was his breaking away from Rome, his ability to call himself supreme head of the church or supreme governor of the Church of England that allowed him to be able to pass that title on unchallenged, and it travels right down the line of kings to this very day. But it has become a recognised and beloved part of the panoply of titles that the British monarch holds to themselves. And in fact, it's become so associated with Britain and its monarchy that in 1849, when a coin called a florin was issued that omitted that part of the title, the people were absolutely furious. There was an uproar. It was called the Godless Florin, and there was so much of a ruckus about it being left out that the coins had to be repealed, new ones had to be struck, and it was never done again. So that, ladies and gentlemen, is the story of Defender of the Faith, and how, although we come to think of as Henry VIII's own personal acquisition, he wasn't the first king to hold it on these islands, and he wasn't the last either. As always, History Haulers, let me know in the comments what you think about this story. Was this something that you knew already, or was it brand new information to you? Let me know there. And while you're at it, why don't you check out some of the other videos from this channel? If you're a history lover, there's plenty on here, and indeed on our sister channels on TikTok and on Instagram that will whet your historical whistle, so to speak. So as always, History Haulers, thanks for watching, and I'll see you in the next one.